Hey friends, the views of our guests do not necessarily reflect the views of Let's Talk Menopause. Let's Talk Menopause does not provide medical advice. The content in this podcast is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified healthcare provider with any questions that you may have.
Welcome to Hello Menopause. I'm your host, Stacy London. Hello Menopause is changing the conversation around menopause. In every episode, we explore the physical, emotional, and mental changes that women experience during this transformative stage in life. This season, we're so thankful to our sponsor, Versally. The options for menopause care can be overwhelming, which is why they've done the research to help you navigate all of them. Versally is a one-stop shop for expert advice, curated products, and access to virtual care. It's where menopause makes sense. Visit Versally.com to learn more.
Jennifer Weiss-Wolf, hi. We're here. Welcome to Let's Talk Menopause. I'm so happy to see you. And I'm so grateful that you're here with us because you are such a legend in the menopause and menstruation circles, because I want to talk about that whole world from menstruation to menopause in policy and legislation, how we're talking about equity when it comes to women's rights, and especially medically. So I have some questions that I would like to start with. And your advocacy for policy changes is really, I think, pretty important. What parallels do you see in advocating for policy changes in menopause in women's health?
Okay, well, first I'm going to say it is my double pleasure to be here with you. I love talking to you, Stacy. You're one of the most insightful people I've ever had the pleasure to be in company with. So I am so happy to be here with you. Every other time we've had a conversation or been part of, a discussion or a panel together, you always give me things to think about. So anyway, I'm thrilled to be here.
Oh, I'm so honored. First of all, I didn't pay her to say that, people, just anybody listening. And it's like, I those kind of compliments just like fill me with so much joy, because I don't think there are enough people yet talking about it. There's, the group, the pioneer group, I think that started a lot of this discussion, but that was only recently. You have been toiling behind all the conventions and now, big menopause celebrations and symposiums and things like that. You've been doing this a lot longer than that. And you also have been looking at really the connection of reproductive health when it comes to the way that women are treated in the world.
I have been toiling in a lot of these ideas for a long time. And the through line for me actually between menstruation and menopause and reproductive health is democracy. And in the moment that we're in now, especially, it becomes like all that much more clear. And I'll bring us to the here and now, and then sort of throw it back to where it started. I've actually written 2 pieces this week. There have been things that have happened already that tie to menopause and menstruation, because the way authoritarians act and behave has a lot to do with how they view women, with how they view sex, with how they view gender. Maybe that's the word we're not allowed to say anymore. But it is all deeply connected. And that is really like the story, I think, of both how my brain spins, but also, the jobs and career positions I've had too. But it's interesting. We are right now, for me personally, at the 10-year anniversary of my foray into the world of menstruation. I guess not 10 years of menstruation
yourself, but 10 years of the study.
So 50 years of menstruation and 10 years of thinking about it as a public policy issue. But it was January 2015 when I was first introduced to a couple of kids in my own community that were collecting tampons and pads for our local food pantry. And they had just asked, I was invited to participate in their collection drive. But I guess because of that way that I sort of view the world through this lens of systems, through this lens of law and policy, through this lens of civic engagement and fairness and access to justice, that was really where my head went when I heard about them collecting tampons and pads. Why wasn't there a budget? Who decide, how are decisions made? What was the public funding structure? Like that was immediately what I wanted to know.
Sure. I mean, you and nobody else, by the way. Everybody's like, oh, do I have any tampons or pads to give?
It makes me a lot of fun at parties.
Right? Like, what's the angle here?
I always say I'm a very humorless policy wonk, but I actually do think I'm a kind of funny policy wonk if the two can go together. But yeah, I have a kind of like a humorless train of thought. I immediately go to budget lines and laws and rules and regulations. So I ended up writing, and I wasn't even a public writer at the time. It takes a lot for me now to call myself a writer, even though writing is really what I do. But I hadn't really done too much public writing at the time. And I very, sort of boldly pitched a piece that I had written to the New York Times about it, and they took it. So it was a pretty loud way to start questioning menstruation in public policy for the first, right? And it did garner a lot of attention. And really in 2015, that was the year like our magazines like Cosmopolitan would write articles like the year the period went public. Like it became a really, just where we are right now with menopause being such a big splash in the media, periods became a really big splash in the media. And of course, the lane that I took was really wanting to explore what role public policy played in why they were so represented and why women and girls were so underrepresented when it came to menstruation, and then what the solutions were. And that went like rapid fire. When I look back at that time, it's kind of bizarre because I had led my life not that I became a big public citizen, but suddenly I was bylining articles in, papers of record, and legislators, members of Congress, state legislators, people, from the New York City Council were contacting me and saying, "Oh, what you wrote is really interesting. I'd like to do it." And I was like, "Oh, that's great." Like, I don't even know what it looks like to do this. Like I just kind of made these ideas up and shot them out into the world and had to catch up with them really quickly. But that was what happened. And in fact, here in New York City, where I'm calling in from now, I assume you are too. New York,
Brooklyn BK.
I'm just right now. But New York City became the first jurisdiction in the world to put forward a package of menstruation related bills, legislation. New York City isn't the first jurisdiction to do this. This has actually been done with great innovation in other parts of the globe, ranging from India to Kenya. But here in this country, and even I would say globally, putting it under the umbrella of leading with menstruation, not just sliding it into a budget bill or an education bill, but saying we want to step forth and say that menstruation needs to be a matter of public policy. So with this phrase that I had created, menstrual equity, they put these bills forward, and New York became the first jurisdiction in the United States to mandate the free provision of period products in all of its schools, shelters, and correction facilities.
Which is huge.
Well, it's huge, right? I mean, it's interesting. Scotland had its own national law, probably 5 or 8 years later, and there was a lot of credit and excitement about the first nation to do this. But Scotland is still like a fraction of the size of New York City.
Right. Isn't it the size of New Jersey?
Population, right? So New York City stepping forth really was important, both because of the reach of the legislation and the replicability of it, or the model or example that it set.
I just want to go back to one thing that you said, Jennifer, before it gets away from me. You said that, the kind of menstruation and menstrual equity took off very quickly. Not, you wrote this article that people who are involved in policy really started to pay attention. Because of this article, you said that Cosmopolitan was talking about, like the period goes public. How much do you think the media had to do with the speed in which these bills were written?
A lot.
And put up?
And I'm somebody who really loves to work in and within the media. I think I really kind of bought into the idea that the court of public opinion is as important as the court. And if we want to use the court as, a reference for any kind of legislative or systemic change. is really important. So I myself was hustling hard with working with media, working with magazines, working with news magazines, helping to frame stories. We had a cover story. Newsweek had menstruation and menstrual policy as its cover story in 2016. And it was really, really important to me that it be on the cover, that people walk by newsstands and see it. I have the picture on my wall. I'll pull it down later to show you, even though everyone else won't be able to see it. But so I was doing, I mean, other people were too. I'm just speaking to my own experience, but I was doing a ton of behind the scenes work with the media. In fact, the Cosmo piece of the story was they had contacted me probably in the early fall of 2015, when there was really starting to be, again, a lot more attention paid and lots of stuff was happening. It wasn't just me writing, wonky articles, but a very well-known musician ran the London Marathon free bleeding, and her story went viral, Kiran Gandhi. There were other things happening culturally and socially. Recall that Hillary Clinton was the front runner at that point. She wasn't even the Democratic candidate. Trump hadn't even entered the scene fully or plausibly. So our country was in a really different narrative moment too in 2015. Although I'll say that Trump gave me one of my best headlines when he did the Megyn Kelly had blood coming out of her wherever line. That was August of 2015. I remember I was actually watching my daughter's field hockey practice, and I was sitting in the stands and writing an article on my phone with my thumbs because it had to get out so fast. I was like, we must respond to this. So it was the whole zeitgeist was pointing to this conversation. But then Cosmo had contacted me. They were doing, I think, just an article, it was just a regular article for the magazine. And I talked to them with the speed and enthusiasm and intensity that I'm talking to you right now. And by the time we finished the call, they were convinced they had to do a whole special series on it. And so they did. They made an entire insert that won awards. It was all aspects of menstruation, including menstrual activism. And then they wanted to be sure that they had an activism or an action step that they could point their readers to. So I had been thinking about this idea of having a national petition regarding the sales tax on menstrual products, aka the tampon tax, which is really a state issue. So that's not anything to do with what the city government was doing. It's not anything to do with what Congress might be doing, but this is state by state by state. Every state determines its own sales tax. But I wanted a national petition because I wanted to put it under the umbrella of a national demand, so that what was happening in California could let you go to your state legislature in Iowa and say, we should be doing this too. And I wanted states to feel competitive with each other about who was getting there first. So I told them this idea. It was a little bit of a pie in the sky idea. And I mean, especially for me, you might know, I'm not really on social media. I don't play there. I'm just a little too dorky for that. But it ended that they said, okay, so we'll join you on this petition. And I said, oh, that would be great. Cosmo putting out the petition. And then they basically had me set the whole thing up. And I did it on change.org. And I was like, are you sure? Because I have no design sense. I have no idea how to make this look like it belongs to Cosmo. And then folks paid attention. We made this really fabulous petition. It got about 100,000 signatures pretty quickly. And then shortly after that, gosh, it's so funny to relive these days. I haven't thought about 2015 in a long time. President Obama got asked by a YouTuber. That's where the youths were then. There was no TikTok. And a YouTuber, he was doing interviews with young YouTubers to show, it's what's old is new again, to show that he was hip. And so one of these YouTubers asked him about the tampon tax, which then made that issue go completely viral. So there was so much really in the entire ecosystem during that time. And it was a really great moment to test all these ideas about public opinion and policy and organizing and activism.
And misogyny, I bet.
And then when Trump was elected, certainly to tell the story of misogyny and at a broader level, what it looks like when women are left out of decision-making, are left out of the story, are left out of everything. I would dare say that a lot of the legislation around menstruation, part of the reason it's been so popular and bipartisan is because it's novel. Like nobody actually had ever thought to ask for this stuff before. It was just ignored and disregarded. And while there is deep misogyny within our systems and within many of the people who occupy leadership in our government at all levels now and then, I still kind of think at the time it had just gone unnoticed more than purposefully shunned aside.
Okay, so interesting. You think it wasn't on purpose. I was going to say that I think that maybe it hasn't been noticed because just women are not given that much attention by the medical community, right? And so periods are kind of, we've been taught that they're yucky and gross and you're bleeding and
Yeah, so I don't mean to say that it's benign. Like it still is very nefarious. But I think that there was like like there was something in between because the advocacy changed that direction very quickly, both before Trump was elected and in the Trump years. I will say that it started to change over the past couple of years, maybe still in the last Trump administration, but I think even in what we started to see, that entire mentality permeating, especially our state legislatures and state governments, which is that the whole anti-woke, and no one can see that I'm doing air quotes there, that that discussion and that discourse with bans on education and books and talking about gender and talking about and expressing support even for the LGBTQ community started to literally like bleed into menstruation related stuff too, where things that had been very pragmatic and pretty neutral, period products in schools suddenly became a hot button issue, became parental rights issue, became, became far more controversial than it was in a I think maybe in the 2015 to 2018 or 2019 period of time. But all of that leads me to get back to your original question, which was menstruation to menopause. Um, I had sort of a not so humble idea in 2020 when I started paying more attention to my menopausal self that pivoting from menstruation policy to menopause policy would be a very simple thing and who but not to do it. And it turned out to be so different from that. And I had so much to learn about what the state of play was for menopause in public policy and what we had paid attention to in the past and why that colored what we did or didn't know and pay attention to here and now. And so it was a far more complicated story than I ever imagined. And I have nothing but like enormous gratitude and whatever word is bigger than gratitude. Like I feel like everyone I got to meet in this community was like heaven sent, because between the advocates and the doctors and the innovators, I became educated and my brain was able to start going, okay, so this is how you thread it together. This is what the policies could look like or should look like.
well, tell me a little bit about that. Like, I know you've written with Oma Shadi, Bernie Scott. I know you've written with Dr. Sharon Malone. You've done articles with them. Very much, I think, in the center of this kind of menopause conversation. How did you see the parallels between menstruation, what you'd already done in terms of menstruation policy, and menopause? I'm curious because for me, the thing that threads the two together is that it's just gross because women are experiencing it, and it's even grosser when it's menopause because women are older, and Lord knows we have an ageism problem in this country. So, it's getting better, but I don't think that it's gone away. And I do wonder if that also, against that political climate, which was a lot more positive in 2015, really got hard when, we all started talking about menopause in like 2018, because, that's another gross aspect of female physiology nobody wants to talk about or know about.
Yeah, well, that's what I assumed the connection was going to be, that it was going to be like, obviously, the trajectory of our life is we go from menstruation to menopause. There's lots of stuff in between, but it's it's the bookends of that system, that reproductive system. So I assumed that the stigma and shame that kept menstruation from the public discourse before 2015 in a really big way, or in a really mainstream way, was the same thing that plagued menopause. But what I learned is that it's true that the stigma and the shame also attach to menopause, and it attaches in a slightly different way because it's tied in with aging and misogyny and all the things that come together when you think about both of those in one breath. But that even wasn't it. It actually, what I learned, came down to the science, and science is inherently political. As we're seeing it fully right now, if anyone didn't believe it. But the science was really the big barrier for menopause in a way that I don't think is true for menstruation. And it doesn't mean there's not a need for more research and understanding of many aspects of menstruation, but the policies themselves were largely focused on the ability to get to access menstrual products, whether it was through economic barriers or social or educational barriers, as well as to have, sort of accurate, available information and education around menstruation, and perhaps some advocacy around safety of products. Like that's what most of the menstruation-related advocacy is, and you really don't have to know the science of menstruation to be able to do that. Menopause. Okay, so what I've come to learn through the community that I found and listening to and learning from all the people you named and others.
And others, yes, so many to mention.
Right, so many, is that the science is so stunted, particularly about hormone treatment, that is dominated every aspect of what we know and don't know and what we think we know about menopause. So if we start there, and it doesn't start with 2002 and the WHI, because there's actually a lot to say about the politics and policies of the 20th century that got us to the WHI. Menopause was a priority when women in 1992, it became the year of the woman, and baby boomers stormed into Congress in unprecedented numbers. And that was what initiated the WHI in the first place. And it was for our good. It was women feminist lawmakers who pushed for it. And it came on the heels of celebrity discussions about menopause. Lauren Hutton was, one of the spokespeople.
And wasn't Suzanne Summers a big talker?
He had some of her alternate therapies, pieces of her narrative. But even from starting from the 60s and what's his name, Rob Wilson's book, Feminine Forever, through the 70s, 80s, 90s, there was a lot of consumerism, like Ralph Nader consumerism, and feminist engagement on really wanting to push for new therapies, to understand the safety of them because of the dearth of research and attention paid to women. So it was women demanding those studies. And that was what led us to the WHI. And then we know the story from the 2002, sudden stoppage of the WHI and how that shifted the entire ethos, like the entire landscape changed when hormone therapy became vilified. But then from those 25 years since, the way I describe it often is it's like a ball of twine. It's not even like a ball of yarn that you could throw across the room and you could see the piece of yarn stretch. And it's like a ball of twine where it's all kinked and twisted and gets stuck on things. And you can't unwrap it. You can't undo it. And it's because that lack of research is connected to lack of education. That lack of research is connected to lack of clinical education, where prescriptions aren't even being prescribed, so new doctors aren't learning about them, let alone the learning that's not happening in the classroom environment. that enables commercial industries to, proliferate and sell people who are struggling and not getting the answers they need, potentially products they don't need or products that are unregulated. It created all kinds of other openings around, how menopause treatments were classified by federal agencies, including the FDA, and an unwanted, warning label that is not accurate, that, hinders people from using it. It includes why menopause treatments aren't covered by insurance, but other treatments, can cost $1, especially treatments, for male sexuality. And then anyway, so that's the ball of twine. All these things are kind of floating around together and they all touch each other, that none of them exists in a vacuum. What's happening in commerce is certainly connected to what's not happening in research. What's not happening in medicine is connected to why people are so uneducated.
And also, women, I think, are quite angry in a lot of cases. There's just this unbelievable frustration. I've heard so many people just in conversation. I mean, not my own scientific research, but that, they don't feel heard by their doctors. And they're like, but my gynecologist is a woman. I'm like, if your gynecologist is a Gen Xer, right, or a boomer, whatever, they probably got very little education to begin with in menopause. It's not a question of being a woman or a man. It's the way that we've looked at medicine is just patriarchal. It's not about what this, you're talking about this kind of a health equity that women still don't possess and bodily autonomy.
It's this giant brewing kettle right now. It's like, no, there's no one piece of it that is like the smoking gun to all of it. Although if I had to attribute the most amount of blame to anything, I would attribute it to the NIH and their refusal to issue a modern statement about hormone therapy that could help create some more paths towards solutions. But by and large, it's all very mushed up, and it makes it hard to solve.
That really sort of leads to my next question, because, I know that you've spoken at the White House and before Congress, as well as state legislatures, major city governmental bodies. But how have these experiences shaped your approach to advocating for equity around women's reproductive health? And really, what are the biggest obstacles that you faced and in these contexts? And I'm curious if that's really what it is. Like, it's just so interconnected that to kind of pull these strands apart makes it really difficult to get clarity around the topic.
So a couple things I've learned along the way, and I'll sort of apply them in my wonkish way to the different kinds of governmental leaders.
You be the best little wonk you could be.
Wish there was like a sexier word than wonk.
I love it. I love wonk.
Anyway, in state legislatures where there is a lot of power, there's a lot that can happen through state budgets, through through all the different ways that they have oversight. The level of education and fluency that most state legislators who are they're in greater percentages, obviously men, have about women's bodies is really stunning. And if you're thinking stunningly low, like I don't mean stunning in a good way, and you're especially thinking about the fights around reproductive rights, whether it's abortion or IVF or contraception, it should be really terrifying how little they know about how our bodies work. And I saw that firsthand when I went to talk about menstruation. And people would often ask if, talking to, going into a room full of men to talk about periods felt intimidating. And I would always say it's like the exact opposite. You have so much power in your ability to be comfortable talking about something that clearly makes them like embarrassed.
Comfortable.
But my goal wasn't to further their embarrassment. My goal was to bring them in and bring them along. So I learned how to, show comfortable authority where I wouldn't use slang or nicknames. I would say things very bluntly and clearly. I would invite them to do the same. I would pause and let them have a chance to engage with me. And then they learned they weren't going to like die or melt into the ground, talking about it. And they would, and you'd have an opportunity to certainly educate them and potentially even move them along. And one of the most interesting things I learned along the way was I ended up befriending this male Republican legislator from Illinois. At the time, Illinois had a Republican-led state legislature and a Republican governor. And I met this guy. His name is Steve Anderson. He's no longer serving, but I met him through some related work. I do some work around the Equal Rights Amendment too, and I met him in the ERA space. And Illinois had taken the lead in passing legislation to eliminate the tampon tax and mandate period products in schools. But I'd yet to meet him, in any of that work I was doing. But then when I met him around the ERA stuff, I asked him, where he stood on that, like how he voted. And he told me that he voted in favor as soon as he started talking to his constituents about it. He saw how important it was to them. And I'll just qualify, this was like a downstate Illinois guy. It wasn't like Chicago or anything. He was a real deal. He was really anti-abortion. And he was we probably didn't agree on too many issues. And when I asked him if he'd learned anything from that, or if that helped him to see other issues differently, he said, it's really interesting that you say that, because I saw for a lot of my colleagues, it really did open them up to think a little differently about some of the economic issues around, personal health that the women in our state face. And he went on to share that the Republican legislature ended up in that term expanding the state's contraceptive coverage, its equal pay provision in the budget. And that was the year, I think it was 2018, that was the year that Illinois became the 37th state to ratify the federal Equal Rights Amendment. And when Virginia became the 38th state, that was getting all the states that were needed to ratify the federal amendment. And that's a whole other story about what its status is. But the idea that he could thread the needle from conversations about menstruation that they'd never had before to these other wins was really exciting to me. So I got him to go on record with that. We wrote an op-ed together for Newsweek where we explained that in it. And that was very exciting. But I'll also say that at the federal level, so the White House meeting that I had was not about menopause. And I know it's interesting because in the past year, there have been a lot of White House meetings about menopause. I dare say there won't be too many the next 4, but I'll get to why I also think you never know. But I had actually gone to talk about menstruation in the context of the Dobbs decision when it came down in 2022, overturning Roe versus Wade. There was a lot of concern about data and personal data that was collected by people who use period tracking apps, and whether that posed, a security or a safety concern for people. So that was what I got invited to present on. And it wasn't even like one of these big old meetings things. It was 5 people in the room with Vice President Harris. And we had 15 minutes to make our case to her. And she, in her prosecutorial style, grilled us and wanted to know. So that was my role. And I have to tell you, I'll say it out loud to anyone listening. I know very little about the Fourth Amendment. I know very little about the privacy concerns. So it was curious and interesting to me that they didn't bring a tech or a privacy expert to talk about period tracking apps, but they brought somebody who just cared deeply about the way menstruation plays out in our laws. And that was sort of how the conversation turned. And I told Vice President Harris the story of these male legislators who were completely, ignorant about menstruation. And I told her my own concerns that why people rely on period tracking apps are because of the dearth of information and the stigma that is attached to how we treat menstruation, that when people become, of the age where they want to know more about their bodies, or they want to track because they're trying to get pregnant or trying not to get pregnant, or other things they want to know about themselves, they're stuck realizing that they know so little about their body, and it's been completely stigmatized.
Don't you think that's true of women our age who hit menopause? I mean, I feel like Gen X got so angry because we were like, what in the hell is happening? Nobody said boo about menopause to us growing up.
So that was where the conversation went. And, and I was able to answer enough of their questions about things that we should and don't have to be concerned about in terms of the data collection.
I want to go back to that as well, because I am surprised that there was no privacy or tech person in the room. And since that time, there have been a number of apps accused of collecting data based on what state you live in. And people are incredibly concerned about that.
Yeah, I mean, if we want to talk about the apps for a second, and this is true for the menopause apps as much as it is for the menstrual ones. I mean, especially because a lot of people using the menopause apps are still using them because they're still having their periods. So they're all of the concerns that apply around pregnancy and period tracking apps absolutely apply to menopause apps if you're not postmenopause. So just putting a pin in that idea of itself that probably people don't really think about, but plenty of 45-year-olds find themselves accidentally pregnant. But I should qualify to say that the White House had plenty of privacy and tech people in their stable at other meetings. It would just happen to be this one. I showed up as the person who was talking much more about menstrual literacy, education, and sex education, and why those matter so much in this now post-Dobbs environment, as does the privacy concerns. With the biggest caveat that I'm not a privacy or a tech expert. My basic understanding is that as a matter of commercial practice, a lot of these apps share information, even if it's like aggregated data. And a lot of that can still have an adverse effect on us. The aggregated data can, because it can change insurance rates, it can change profiles that employers consider. Like there's a lot about our collective health that is information that we're giving away when we use those.
How do you think that affects like things like labor rights or workplace policies?
It's all that murky interconnection because, again, the aggregated data, if it's showing that something is going to be overly expensive for an insurance company to cover because the vast majority of users are presenting a certain way, that can all come back to bite us down the line. And it's really tricky because I also get with the dearth of federal funding for research related to women's bodies. We all know the stat, it's like 10% or less of NIH funding goes to women's health. The idea that these apps have like a mass market and that they can collect a lot of really valuable data is also really challenging. We would want to be able to use that perhaps in a good way.
Is that a place where you could see, at least maybe on the state level, of legislature working with those kinds of companies?
No, I think it certainly has to be national, and we're thinking about it in terms of the kinds of protections and usages that data is applicable to. I think it's a bigger problem than a state by state patchwork.
The only reason I ask about that is that I thought that you were saying in some ways, at least they're collecting data that could be used toward scientific research.
And some of them do. And that's sort of balanced with the challenges of the aggregated data, how it gets sold and borrowed and used. It's also balanced with the safety of the companies. Their information could be hacked. There's things that you have to be concerned about. And then there's the individual safety about whether information you've been putting in can be subpoenaed, can be collected by law enforcement, can be used against you. And that ranges from information you might have put in, about the last time you had your period, if somebody's wanting to prove that you were pregnant or show that you didn't, that you have a failed pregnancy, and is, using that for purposes that could be harmful for you. And whether law enforcement access that, whether social media posts can be used against you. We have seen that happen already where people have been arrested, and that's been part of the case against them, that they shared something on their social media about, their whereabouts.
Okay, but that's terrifying.
That's the new dystopian reality we live in. And we're going in a little bit of a sidebar here, but I think the important thing to know is, there are definitely Electronic Frontier Foundation, EFF, and I'm sure the ACLU. There are a lot of places that'll have really good information about, how to protect yourself and your own data. But the real truth of the matter is we, and maybe this is like a pivot to a broader conversation back to menopause too, we're in uncharted territory right now with the political administration, and abortion and women's health and reproductive health and gender health is so clearly, and bodily autonomy maybe is the umbrella for all of that, is so clearly in the bullseye. And these things are happening already. So it's not like this is a Handmaid's Tale type, warning. These things are happening already. They happen to folks who are maybe you'd think of as more marginalized in society, people who are low income, people,
Who are unhoused.
right? And the only thing to know about that is if they're coming for them, they're coming for you.
Of course.
You know, so we all have to take really seriously that this administration's hostility to our bodies is real. And that is the new normal.
I mean, but it's not normal.
It's the new reality. It's so abnormal that it's horrifying, but it is where we're at.
Well, I want to talk a little bit more about that. Like, you've spoken a lot about the idea of changing public opinion as a critical component of achieving policy changes, right? And right now, I think the temperature in this country is that misogyny is out and proud right now. This is a little bit like what we saw after the George Floyd murder in 2020, because the outrage just completely bubbled over. And I don't believe that we're experiencing the same kind of outrage that we did in 2016 when we all wore pink hats and we were like, we're women, we're not going backwards. I think we realized that this time in the 47's reign, they're much more organized. They're much more organized with the kind of chaos they want to create, and they're much more organized in how they are spreading dis and misinformation. What can we do? Like, how has the media landscape, including social media, helped or hindered the menstrual and the menopause movement? One thing I remember in 2021 was talking with the press about the fact that, one, we don't have equity, and two, something like menopause is not something you write about once, because then it's a trend, not an actual fact of life that we are, a reckoning, or whether there are medical issues present or all of those things. It just becomes this, one-trick pony. And we've really seen a lot change. I mean, the amount of people I see talking about on menopause and social media in the last 5 years is remarkable. What are your thoughts on that?
So, yeah, I mean, I have a lot of thoughts about the way all of it. I mean, you just set it up really well. And I'm going to stick to menopause right now in my response, even though I have lots of thoughts about why the moment feels so different than in 2017 or, any other time. And that probably is like, a whole other podcast. But for the menopause piece of it, what I'm finding really palpable right now, and I'm sticking to this narrative. I started writing a few pieces about it, and I'm going to keep writing it. I'm going to keep getting it out there, because this is the narrative I want to stick. That 5-year arc, or that 5-year trajectory that you talked about for interest in and willingness to talk about menopause publicly, whether it's on social media, whether it's celebrities, whether whether it's regular people who are engaging in all of their lives, also applies to the lawmakers and the people who can help start to change some of the systems that are part of that twisted up ball of twine, whether it's releasing more funding for research, or whether it's demanding better educational standards, or whether it's mandating health insurance, or Medicaid coverage of hormone treatments, or whether it's changing the labeling in ways we even deal with, we even put hormone treatments out in the world, or other menopause treatments. So there's been an actually measurable progress on that front. So if the conversation really bubbled up in 2018, so we call it 2015 the year of the period. 2018 would be the year that people started talking about menopause, right? 24 was the year that government officials really started taking it seriously. So over the past year, and I'll get to now, because I know now is so different from that, even then 365 days ago. But over the past year, we've seen 4 big bills introduced in Congress, 1 in the Senate, 3 in the House, all focused on menopause research and education, all bipartisan, all with both Republicans and Democrats signing on. We saw a White House executive order that has already released $1 billion that I'm trying to figure out how safe all that money is given these freezes and things like that. But as far as we can say right now, that executive order is still standing and those funds had been released. We've seen state legislatures in several states, California, Louisiana, and Illinois in particular, pass laws that make either menopause education more robust or make menopause treatments more affordable or accessible. And I'll explain what each of those is. But that all happened in the past year. And now that we're here, right now it's January 31st, 2025.
We'll have to speak in a year and see where we're at.
Okay, so this is what I'm saying is going to be the story of 2025. We cannot let that progress falter. We've come too far to decide that it's just a lost cause or is going to get lost in the shuffle of all the other harm the administration is doing. So we have to find all of the back and side doors that enable that that progress to continue. On the state level, it's not that complicated. The states have, other than maybe some state lawmakers wanting to emulate or imitate Trump, states can do what they want. So getting a lot of these ideas translated to more states is absolutely doable. And there are lots of states that are looking to do it. I've talked to legislators and executive leadership from New York to Michigan who are all ready to go.
What makes you hopeful about sort of getting in through these kind of back channels?
Not even back, they're front. They're just not what you always think are the fanciest thing.
Right. Okay. Fair enough. But I just mean in terms of this 47th president, I feel like he's going to rescind everything. And it doesn't feel like I don't have the same optimism that I had for for Biden and the last administration for their commitment to women's health.
There's no commitment, but they're trying to do a lot. They clearly have their targets set. Reshaping the federal government, targeting trans people in particular, adding DEI, right? Okay, so that's all very clear. Abortion is going to be there somewhere. It looks like he's still kind of pacing that out. Although they've done plenty of shots that are painful already. But all that said, I'm gonna be careful about how they say this because I don't want to show our full hand here. Although maybe I'll guess that he's not listening to this podcast.
I don't think he's a fan.
But they're not paying much attention to this, meaning we can move stealthily. It also is true that they know that abortion in particular is wildly popular among the electorate. And it's not just an opinion. 80% of people poll after poll after poll, show that they support abortion rights in some way. So he's going to be operating pretty gingerly around that, as I think they already are. And women's midlife health, dare I say it, might be the low-hanging fruit or cheap grace that they'll be okay with, right? It's not as polarized. It's not as partisan as some of these other women's health issues.
Certainly not as polarizing, but I also feel like, what does Trump care about anybody who's over 30?
The only things, right, he doesn't care at all. He thinks we're vile. So, but I mean, there are some technical things now. The attack on the federal government in particular is probably the most challenging. How the agencies work, how funding is released, who's going to be in charge of these agencies. That's probably where it'll be the trickiest. But in Congress, for example, all this legislation had bipartisan support before, so it'll continue to have bipartisan support. And if they're able to pass this, I don't know what really drive he would have to veto it.
It's just cruelty. I don't disagree. I think that you're right. Sort of being invisible as a middle-aged person in this culture.
Maybe it works to our advantage a little bit.
Maybe it works to our advantage. My fear is that it will not. My fear is that that he will go out, because there's this trend in the Republican Party of going back to the trad wife model, and we aren't talking about bodily autonomy. And you've talked about how it's inextricably linked to the health of democracy.
Yeah, I know. It's a little talking out of both sides of my mouth, because what I believe and how I would advocate could be two different things.
Oh, interesting. I like that distinction. That's also incredibly helpful.
There has to be some pragmatism. Do you think that when, there can be legislators like this guy from Illinois with whom I don't agree on a single thing, but both had the interest in seeing this piece of it forward. And so, but look, I want to back up and say my advocacy would never, or I wouldn't imagine a world where leaning on stereotypes like being invisible and all that would be what I would be recommending. Path you take an advocate often doesn't, you don't have to wear your whole self. Like I don't have to come in wearing my t-shirt that with my slogan on it.
I mean, I should hope not.
Right. We all do it in certain ways. But here's the takeaway. Trump isn't the last line on a lot of this stuff. He would be on a bill out of Congress, but he wouldn't necessarily be on a federal agency directive. Still getting the FDA to remove black box warning on vaginal estrogen has nothing to do with the president of the United States.
I mean, thank God.
Right. And then especially in the states where, like I said, California made menopause, various menopause educational materials part of the continuing medical education products that doctors can use. That's a really great example of a meaningful reform. The 2 states that have now mandated insurance coverage of hormone therapy, the first one to do so was Louisiana, not exactly bastion of like blue. So there you go. It's possible. And then Illinois, interestingly, Illinois had done so the year prior in 2023. And it was led by a Republican, and it was meant for women who had hysterectomies and went into, earlier premature menopause as a result. And I imagine the backstory of that is some dudes that's happened to his wife, and now it's a problem because it happened to him. But then the women legislators in the state took that legislation a step further, and they've added an amendment to it that is MHT for all, covered by insurance, and that goes into effect next year. So what was there not this movement proliferating all around them? I don't know that those legislators would have said, hey, why don't we just take this the distance and do it? So those examples out of California, Illinois, and Louisiana give me a ton of hope.
Oh, I didn't know that I had any hope until hearing that.
If we could something like that happen in 47 more states, and then all 50 states in the country had some menopause-friendly policy, that's not a bad year.
That would be a great year. I will take that.
That's what I'm for now.
But I think that that's part of the reason that I've been so pessimistic is like, I don't know what's going on state to state. And I haven't heard, what's going on. We were so excited about President Biden and Dr. Jill Biden, really announcing this women's health initiative, and that there was just so much kind of goodwill behind it. And I guess I don't feel that anymore from the government. And I wonder, I don't know if we're looking at the decline of democracy, but I wonder the connection between the fight for bodily autonomy and equity, whether or not there's any correlation there between, the decline of democracy and the rise of authoritarianism.
Yes, all those things are interconnected, and all of those things are happening. Bodily autonomy is intrinsic to a functioning democracy.
Explain why. Why is it intrinsic?
On so many levels, right? On the most immediate level, that control of one's body is freedom. And that freedom to be can't exist if the government has control of decisions we make over our bodies. So it starts right there. But then it's when we think about sort of our engagement in the body politic, right? We put bodies to use in 2 ways. We can't contribute fully if we are also beholden to the government in that way, in a way that men's bodies are not. And yes, I know there are certain things, like people will counter and be like, well, you're not allowed to use drugs. You're not allowed to do this. You're not allowed to do that. The actual ability to have freedom in one's body is our starting place, is our North Star. But then when you think about all the ways that not having freedom over your body impinges upon your ability to participate in society, all of the ways you can and can't show up in your community, for your family, and that includes voting and all of those things too. So to me, that's the most simple way I talk about the interconnection between the two. So then here's where it gets a little headier. I don't think we've been accustomed to talking about menopause as bodily autonomy. This is the piece I just wrote this past week And I published it at this really, I'm going to do a plug for this really funky new Substack.
Do it.
It's called Contrarian.
Say it again. It's called what?
The Contrarian. And it was created by Jennifer Rubin, who was a columnist at the Washington Post who stepped down in light of the ownership of the entity. And then this guy, Norm Eisen from Brookings, who is like knows more about democracy than just about anybody. So Jen Rubin and Norm Eisen are running this site. And they reached out to ask if I would write about women's health for the site. And I said, okay, but I want to write about menopause. So the first piece I wrote was this week, and it made the case that for too long, we've talked about bodily autonomy only in the context of pregnancy and reproduction.
That is what I say too. I love it.
Okay, so we'll put this piece up. And this says that this stage of our life is also about bodily autonomy. And here's the good news. This stage of our life probably requires some different advocacy tools and approaches, but I think that they have legs right now. I do think they'll have some legs in the federal government, and I absolutely know they will in state government. So that's a good year's worth of work to do. And then I will add to that for folks who are listening to this and think, all right, well, you've convinced me, I want to get involved. I put out this digital booklet called A Citizen's Guide to Menopause Advocacy. And you and I will talk offline after about where my book project is going, because you were part of the book project. But this is a like little bite-sized piece of the book project that I took off because I thought that it was too important to start telling people this right away versus the time it takes to publish a book. So I peeled off all the things regular people can do right here and now when it comes to all of these ideas. Everything we've talked about right now, the possibility of your state mandating, an insurance coverage of hormone treatment, the possibility of your state being a catalyst for better menopause education, even things you can say and do to your members of Congress to keep this issue alive for them and to know that it's important to you as their constituent. And it's very user-friendly. It's like how to do this, how to do that, link here, link. So it's Mary Claire Haver very generously designed it and joined forces with me on it. And so you can find it on her website. It's a PDF. It's free. You don't have to do anything to get it. You don't have to sign up for anything. All you and you can get it. And Maria Shriver wrote the foreword for it. And really puts it into like great, sort of historical and health focused context. But it's all really doable. And if we all start doing it, I don't know, I am optimistic.
Well, Jennifer, first of all, thank you so much, because there was so much packed into this podcast. I can't even believe it. But I think the first most important thing to me is like, what's the action item is to download that PDF, because just to be more educated, it already, like the Citizen's Guide, it's a guide, it's a handbook, it's something that you can follow.
That's exactly what it is. It was funny when we talked about its creation. I came up with this idea right after the election. I was like, this is what we need to do. We need to keep our eyes on the prize. We don't want to be distracted by all the distractions that are going to be thrown our way. This is how we go forward. And this is what makes it easy for everyday people. I knew Mary Claire would have access to lots of those everyday people, the people who listen to her, who are patients, who are the ones who are frustrated by the care that they've gotten and would be motivated to want to be part of a bigger solution. But it was a joke. I said, I don't want it to have a flashy name. I don't want it to be I don't want it to all sound like a bit too clever. I just want to call it what it is, A Citizen's Guide to Menopause Advocacy. And it's they did such a beautiful job in taking like all of my dense words and turning it into something that your eye can dart around and you can jump around to, what you want to do. You can jump around the document if one thing is, less interesting or meaningful to you. And I also actually want to say, since we're part of the Let's Talk Menopause house right now, that their Unboxing Menopause campaign is a big piece of it too. And that's all linked and discussed in the Citizen's Guide, because that's also a really easy way for everyday people to be involved, is just signing the petition that we're planning on, what it's going to look like to have a full court campaign in the new FDA about removing the inaccurate and outdated warning label on vaginal estrogen. So all of it's kind of like a choose your own adventure. you can decide what you want when you get in it. It's pretty easy to navigate. So yeah, that's the action item here for sure.
Yeah. It sounds so important to me. And again, I think, what I've taken away from all of this is it really knowledge is power. And without knowledge, we don't get to the autonomy. We don't get to the bodily autonomy. We don't get to autonomy in general. And the more step-by-step instruction that we have from the people who have put in the hard work allows us to disseminate that information far and wide. So somebody who's never going to be able to afford to see Mary Claire Haver is still going to be able to understand how to be active in this community and how to be helpful to other people. That is how I think really grassroots campaigns make the biggest difference. You start with a community that you can reach that's small, and then you get bigger and bigger and bigger, like the tree, the rings on a tree. And I'm so hopeful now that we've spoken. And I'm so happy to have had you on the podcast. Jen, thank you so much.
Oh my gosh, thank you for having me. And I always love talking to you.
I love talking to you too.
Let's Talk Menopause is a national nonprofit organization invested in changing the conversation around menopause so women get the information they need and the healthcare they deserve. Please visit letstalkmenopause.org for a wealth of menopause information, including a symptoms checklist, information about long-term health risks, how to navigate menopause at work, and interviews with health experts, and so much more. This episode of Hello Menopause is sponsored by Versally. Visit Versally.com for the info and products you need and the menopause care you've been searching for. Hello Menopause is a production from Let's Talk Menopause, produced in partnership with Studio Kairos. I'm your host, Stacy London. Editing and mixing by Revoice Media. Hello Menopause is available on Spotify, Apple, Google, and wherever you get your podcasts.